They called it a salvage mission. That was the word Zero used. Salvage. And I heard it through the wall of my cell on the third day, before they took me to the cold chamber for the first time. He had a voice like stone, dragged across stone, and even filtered through 6 inches of poured composite, it carried weight. Salvage. As if Earth were a shipwreck. As if humanity were cargo that had spilled and settled and been waiting patiently on the ocean floor for someone methodical enough to come collect it. I want you to understand what I was before any of this started, because it matters more than I knew at the time. It matters because the Syndicate spent a great deal of effort convincing me, and themselves, that I was nothing. A clever animal in a good suit. A biological lockpick with just a conditioning to make it past the first door. That is what an intelligence operative is to them. A tool with the pulse, useful until it talks and then disposable. I had been running field operations for 11 years at that point. I had been burned twice, recalled once, decorated in a ceremony that officially never happened, in a room with no windows and 4 other people whose names I still cannot say. My name was Jorge Rubio, and I was 32 years old, and I had never once believed that a mission briefing told me the whole truth. This one told me almost none of it. The doctor. That was how he introduced himself. No name beyond the title. A small, compact man with wire-rimmed glasses, and the particular manner of someone who had outlived several governments and expected to outlive several more. Gave me the essentials in a room that smelled of recycled air and institutional coffee. The kind of room that exists inside very old buildings that were built for one purpose and have been quietly repurposed so many times that the walls have absorbed all of it. A scientist had been taken. His name was Mulebran. He was the foremost living authority on a substance he had named Argentinian. Not the nation, the metal. A synthetic alloy he had spent 20 years, developing in 3 different laboratories, under 4 different research grants, whose specific molecular lattice structure disrupted the resonance cascade that made atomic detonation possible. Shield material. The only one that had ever worked at scale. Mulebran carried the full formula in his head, and nowhere else, which was either genius-level operational security or catastrophic personal arrogance. And the doctor had not survived this long by committing to an opinion on that particular question. The Syndicate had taken him. The doctor said Syndicate. The way a man says the name of a disease he has been treating for a long time. Not with fear exactly, but with the particular settled tiredness of someone who has lost colleagues to it and has stopped expecting that to change. He did not tell me what the Syndicate was, not fully. He told me they were organized, that they were extremely well-resourced, that their leadership structure centered on a figure known only as Zero, and that Zero had never, in 11 years of documented operations, failed to extract what he wanted from anyone he had taken into custody. He told me that Mulebran was probably still alive, probably, because a dead scientist cannot be questioned, and they needed the formula intact and unambiguous. He told me a great many things in that room. He did not tell me what the Syndicate was. I found out later, we all did. Partner on the insertion was a woman named Anna, who was working a cover as a hostess at a nightclub called Orchideas. That was the name of the establishment, and also the name of the woman who ran it. A tall, cold beauty with the specific stillness of someone who is always calculating and has gotten very good at not showing the math. I would later learn that she was Sirai Siro's primary field officer in this hemisphere, the one who had personally arranged Mulebran's abduction, the one who managed the network of informants and sleepers, and turned assets that had been eroding our operations for the better part of 3 years. She was very good at what she did. The fact that I was in her club for 4 days without making her, without giving her so much as a moment of uncertainty about my cover, and that she burned me anyway, tells you something about the quality of intelligence she was working with. Anna, my partner, was good too. She moved through that club like water through a pipe. Natural, expected, frictionless. The kind of presence that makes the room feel inhabited rather than observed. She had been undercover for 7 months before I arrived, building relationships, cataloging the network, feeding information, back through cutouts, that the doctor's people were still confident were clean. She had done everything right. 3 days after I made contact with her, Orchidea burned us both. I don't know if it was a leak from the doctor's office, or simply the fact that the Syndicate's intelligence capabilities were substantially better than ours. They were, I would eventually understand, operating from a framework we could not have imagined, with resources and methods that made our most sophisticated operations look like something a clever child had assembled from parts he found in a garage. What I know is that Anna went quiet at 2200 hours on a Tuesday, missed the check-in, missed the backup check-in, missed the emergency signal, and by midnight I was in a vehicle I had not chosen, moving toward a location I did not know, and the two men sitting across from me with their hands folded were not the extraction team I had been waiting for. They hit me once, professionally, and I went to sleep. I woke up in a cell. It was clean, which surprised me. I have been in enough hostile holding facilities in my career to have developed opinions on the subject, the way a traveler develops opinions on hotels. This one was climate-controlled, adequately lit, with a cot that was not comfortable but was not designed to punish. The food that came through the slot in the door was nutritionally complete and entirely without flavor, the kind of sustenance that communicates clearly. We need you functional. We do not particularly need you comfortable. There was a drain in the floor, centered, which told me the room was designed to be cleaned efficiently. I noted all of these details with the automated part of my attention, while the working part cataloged exits, assessed materials, tracked the sounds from the corridor, and began the calculation that every captured operative begins. How long before they start, what method they'll use first, what they most want to know, and what I can give them that will buy time without costing anything I cannot afford to spend. First thing that did not fit was the facility itself. Everything I had been told. Everything the doctor's briefing implied. Everything about how the Syndicate had operated in 11 years of documented activity positioned them as a sophisticated criminal network. Organized, well-funded, globally connected, but fundamentally human in their structure and their appetites. They moved money, they moved information, they moved people. They operated with the intelligence and ruthlessness that comes from being very good at a particular kind of human corruption for a very long time. Crime organizations, even excellent ones, do not build facilities like this. They rent warehouses. They commandeer properties. They occupy existing infrastructure for as long as it is useful and abandon it when it isn't. They do not pour independent foundations. They do not install medical-grade air cycling and independent power systems and climate regulation calibrated to a quarter of a degree. They do not build. This had been built, designed, engineered, constructed by people who intended it to last and intended to use it for purposes that required precision. I sat with that thought for 2 days before they came for me. The man who ran the interrogation sessions introduced himself as Esteban. He was a broad, unhurried man with large hands, and the kind of face that has made a permanent accommodation with whatever it has been asked to witness. Sadistic. Sadism implies a personal investment, a heat in it, and Esteban had no heat at all. He told me what they wanted in a tone of complete professional neutrality, as if reading from a procurement list. The details of my network, the names of the people above me, the extent of the operation that had sent me, the location of any current assets embedded in Syndicate-adjacent organizations. He gave me a day to think about it. He thanked me for my time. The first session was electrical. The frame they strapped me to had adjustable joints calibrated to keep the body in positions that maximized nerve exposure, and the current they applied was controlled enough to inflict maximum sensation without causing the kind of tissue damage that makes a subject unreliable. I am not going to perform bravery. Pain was of a type that makes the word feel like a euphemism for something with no adequate name. I said nothing useful. I said it clearly and several times. Esteban noted this on his clipboard with the air of a man recording a weather observation, thanked me again, and left. The second session was cold. A sealed cylinder, narrow enough that I could touch both walls simultaneously if I spread my arms, with refrigerant running through the walls themselves at a temperature I estimated at around -15. They left me in it for what I calculated from my pulse, and the progression of my symptoms was between 5 and 7 hours. My fingers stopped working at the 2-hour mark. I had been through cold resistance training. Everyone in my unit had. And that training is structured around the idea that if you understand what your body is doing, you can manage it. You stop fighting the shivering, because the shivering is productive. It is your muscles generating heat. And fighting it wastes energy you do not have. You tuck your hands against your torso. You breathe slowly. You find a specific kind of interior stillness that is not the same as calm but functions like it. The training is good, and it works up to a point, and around the 4-hour mark you find the point. My thoughts started to go sideways. Not unconscious. Unconscious would have been easier, would have had the mercy of a clear transition. This was worse. The slow drift of cognition losing its grip on itself. The way a rope frays rather than cuts, still there, but no longer reliable for what you need it to do. I began to lose track of the interval. I knew I was losing track, and could do nothing about the knowledge, except hold it. And then I was not sure I was holding it. I saw my mother's kitchen. The green tile above the stove, the particular way the late afternoon light came through the window over the sink, and hit the copper pot she never used but never threw away. She had inherited it from her own mother and kept it for reasons she never fully articulated, which I had found infuriating as a child and have since understood as the kind of loyalty to the past that is one of the quieter forms of love. I had not thought about that kitchen in 15 years, had not thought about the smell of it, the particular creak of the second step on the back stairs, the sound of the radio she kept on the counter, that was always tuned to something orchestral, and which I had regarded as background noise, until I was old enough to miss it. I came out of the hallucination angry, which was probably what saved me. The anger had nothing to do with the cold or the cell, or Esteban, or any of it. It was anger at the loss, at the distance between the kitchen and this cylinder, at the fact that someone had put me here and was calculating what I was worth. Anger burns like a coal rather than a fire. Slower, less dramatic, but persistent in a way that softer emotions are not. You can cup a coal in your hands for a very long time. I cupped it. I held it all through the next hours, and through the moment when they opened the cylinder, and helped me out, because my legs were not functional on their own, and through the time it took my hands to come back to me. The pins and needles, return of blood, and feeling that is one of the more unpleasant sensations available to the human body. I held the coal through all of it and it did not go out. The third session was the one that changed everything. They brought him in. Zero moved in his chair with the ease of someone for whom the chair had never been a limitation. It was part of him, the way a spine is part of a body, integral, load-bearing, an extension of his will rather than a concession to his circumstances. The engineering in the frame was extraordinary. Silent, precise, responsive to intentions I could not observe being communicated. He was old. Older than anyone else I had seen in this facility by a margin that went beyond arithmetic. His face had the quality of very old stone, shaped by time but not softened by it. Everything structural, nothing decorative. His eyes were pale. Not the pale of a northern European but a different pale. The pale of something that has been in the dark for a long time, and has stopped needing light to see by. He looked at me for 30 seconds with those eyes, and I had the very specific, very physical sensation of being catalogued. Not studied, catalogued. The way a surveyor maps terrain, efficiently, dispassionately, entering data into a system designed for a purpose I could not see. Then he spoke, not to me, to Esteban, who was standing at the room's edge. The language he used was not Spanish. It was not a language I had been trained in. Not a language I could identify as belonging to any human family I knew. The vowels were structured wrong. Not differently stressed, not dialectally shifted, but wrong at a deeper level. As if the sounds had been produced by a respiratory and vocal architecture that was similar to mine but not identical. The rhythm was wrong. The information density of the syllables was wrong. It was a language, clearly, patterned, intentional, grammatically structured. But the grammar was not anything I had ever encountered, or even heard described. Esteban nodded. His expression did not change. They returned me to my cell, and I sat for a very long time in the dark of that clean, precise, carefully maintained cell, and I thought about what I had heard. And by the following morning, I had arrived at the conclusion that I had been avoiding for 4 days. The way you avoid putting weight on a bruise you know is worse than it looks. The Syndicate was not a human organization. Zero was not a human man. Whatever they wanted with Mulibrin's formula, whatever they were looking for under the surface of the world that had required building this facility in this specific location. It had nothing to do with the politics of nations or the appetites of crime. I did not panic. I want to be clear about that. I have heard people describe how they would respond to that kind of revelation. And most of them describe a version of collapse, a failure, of categories, the feeling that the ground has become unreliable. I did not have that. What I had was the opposite. A very specific, very cold focusing of everything I had learned in 11 years of operating in situations where the information I had been given was insufficient to the situation I was actually in. I had been in that situation before. The scale was different. The nature of the threat was different. The work was the same. Assess what is real, identify what is possible, move toward the exit. I was going to get out. I was going to get out, and I was going to bring what I knew with me. That was the job. First, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. They helped me as it happened, not deliberately. They simply stopped, pretending, which in its own way told me more than deliberate disclosure would have. I think they had made a decision about me after the third session. A decision I would only fully understand much later, once the specialist had walked us through what she had spent 11 years piecing together. They had decided that what I knew was less valuable than what I was. Zero had looked at me with those cataloging eyes and made a calculation, and the result was that my face and my biological signature were worth more to his operation than anything stored in my memory. They were going to copy me. The medical wing occupied more of the facility than the detention section, which I registered on the third day when they moved me through it under guard. The smell was specific. Long-term research, specific chemical compounds, the kind of environmental signature that comes from sustained high-precision work rather than single-purpose application. The equipment lining the walls was unlike anything I had encountered in any medical facility, any intelligence installation, any research context I had access to. Some of it I could categorize by function, imaging, analysis, synthesis. But the mechanisms were wrong. The scale was wrong. The integration of biological and mechanical components was wrong in ways I could not articulate except as a persistent, low-level wrongness. The kind your hindbrain registers before your frontal lobe has finished taking inventory. At the end of the wing, behind a glass partition, a unit that resembled a medical imaging scanner in the way that a jet aircraft resembles a hang glider. The same rough concept, different orders of magnitude. They ran me through it for what felt like an hour. From 3 angles, at resolutions I could not measure. Then they returned me to my cell. 4 days after the scan, they walked someone down the corridor outside my door. I heard 2 sets of footsteps, a guard's rhythm and another rhythm slightly different in cadence, slightly less certain in the placement of the feet. The way a copy of a signature is slightly less certain than the original, even when it is technically accurate. The guard said something short. The other footsteps came closer, 3 or 4 steps, and stopped outside the door. Pause that lasted longer than it should have. The length of a pause that suggests something, consulting something, then nothing. I put my ear against the cold composite and listened. My own breathing came back to me from the other side, not an echo, not coincidence. My specific breathing pattern, the slight irregularity in the exhale that I had been carrying since a chest injury 3 years ago, the one that had never fully resolved, the one that showed up in my physicals as a minor anomaly and was otherwise invisible to anyone who was not specifically listening for it. My pattern, from outside the door, coming from something that was wearing my biology like a coat. I sat back against the wall. I took inventory of what I felt. The feelings came in a specific order. Recognition, which was almost immediate. Then a physical revulsion, the kind that comes before the mind has fully caught up with what the body already knows. Then something colder and more useful, which was the recognition that this changed my timetable and my options, but not my goal. They had built a biological copy of me. Not a mask, not a prosthetic, not a chemical alteration of an existing person. They had taken the scan and produced a duplicate, accurate enough to reproduce an autonomous physiological process, breathing with its specific signature, which meant accurate enough to pass any inspection short of a full cellular workup. copy would leave this compound with my face, posture, my fingerprints, whatever understanding of my speech patterns and mannerisms they had derived from monitoring me across multiple days and multiple sessions. It would make contact with the doctor's network. It would present itself as an operative extracted from a burned cover, and it would, with that access, walk whatever Zero needed into the secured facility where Mullibrand's research was archived under the highest classification in our inventory. I understood all of this in under a minute. Then I went back to work on getting out. The woman who ran the medical wing's night rotation was not Anna. That was a coincidence of names I only untangled later. I called her the technician because that was what she was, and because giving her a name felt like a negotiation I had not earned the right to open. She was competent and she was careful, and she moved through her duties with the specific efficiency of someone who has restructured their relationship with what they are doing in order to make it survivable. I recognized it because I have been in adjacent rooms to that same restructuring in a number of people over the course of a career, and because I have had versions of that conversation with myself. The way it works is you find a frame, what you do inside the frame, and you study the frame rather than what's inside it. You are a technician. You are a professional. You are performing a function that would be performed by someone else if you declined it. And your declining would accomplish nothing except your own removal from the situation. The frame is very useful up to the point where something happens that the frame cannot contain. She did not look at me when she checked the cell, came to the door window, checked the monitoring display beside it, made a notation, moved on. 12 seconds, average. Very consistent. The consistency is also part of the frame. I did not try to manipulate her in the technical sense. I want to be precise about this, because the distinction matters to me. Manipulation is the application of pressure to a person's psychology to produce a behavior regardless of their actual preferences. What I did was different. I talked to her through the door, quietly, for 3 nights. I gave her information. I told her what I had worked out. Not all of it. Not the part that had been keeping me awake since the 3rd session, the part about the language, but enough of the shape of it. I told her that the organization she worked for was not what its documentation claimed to be, that the man at the top of it was pursuing something with stakes so large that criminal enterprise was not an adequate frame for it, that whatever she had been told about what this facility's purpose was, the actual purpose was something that did not stop at the edges of any nation or any ideology or anything that human beings had built frameworks to contain. I told her that I was not asking her to be a hero. I was not asking her to act from conscience or courage or anything that required her to be more than she currently was. I was asking her to make one single decision that she could live with afterward, because it had been a long time since she had made one of those. And I thought she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the night shift. She left the first night without responding. The door window was a dark square, and then it was not. She left the second night without responding. I heard her footsteps the length of the corridor, and then nothing. On the 3rd night, she came to the door and stood there for what I estimated was 90 seconds. Long enough that I thought she had made a different decision than the one I was waiting for. Then the lock disengaged. The door opened inward. She stepped back 2 paces and put her hands at her sides and looked at a point on the wall past my shoulder. And I understood that this was how she had chosen to do it. Not watching, so that the frame could reconstitute itself around something she had technically not seen. I stepped past her. I did not thank her. There was nothing I could have said that would have been equal to what she had just done, and I did not try. What happened next in that facility, the specific mechanics of moving through 3 corridors and the medical wing with no weapon and incomplete information about the layout, is the part that the intelligence services have considerable effort asking me not to describe in detail. The operational reasons for that request are legitimate, and I have respected them for years. What I will say is that I moved, that I did not stop, and that the guards who attempted to prevent me from moving are no longer able to speak to their experience of it. Some of them I feel bad about, others I do not. That is the honest accounting, and I see no reason to prettify it. Mullibrand was not in the facility. I searched it as thoroughly as the time and the circumstances allowed, and I did not find him, because he was already gone. Truth serum had done eventually what truth serum does to a man who has been refusing it across multiple sessions, each refusal requiring from the body a cost that accumulates. His heart gave out before he gave them the formula, which was a final act of stubbornness that I consider, in the full context of what was at stake, genuinely heroic. He was a scientist who had spent 20 years building something extraordinary. He had spent those years not knowing why the direction he was working in was the right one, not knowing that he was in dialogue with an engineering project 40,000 years old, not knowing that his work had been detected across interstellar distances by instruments calibrated precisely for what he was doing. He had simply done the work, because the work was interesting, and because it was his, and when the people who wanted it for purposes he could not have imagined had subjected him to every chemical and physical inducement they had available, he had refused. His heart gave out before they could make him speak. I think about Mulebran sometimes. I think about how he died in a facility he did not know the true nature of, surrounded by entities he almost certainly never understood were not human, protecting a formula whose actual significance he could not have known. He was not a soldier. He was not an operative. He was a scientist who got the end of what he was capable of sustaining and discovered, at that end, that what he was capable of sustaining was a great deal. He deserved better than he got. Most people who die in service of something larger than themselves deserve better than they get. That is not a comfortable truth, but it is an honest one. Zero had what he needed anyway, not the formula in its complete form, the location. Mulebran had told them, during the sessions before the end, where the research archive was. Zero would reconstruct the formula from the archived work. It would take time and analysis, but it would be done. He did not need Mulebran anymore, and had not needed him for the final days. He had been keeping him for reasons that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with the efficiency of using a resource, until it is fully consumed. I reached the surface just before dawn. The air outside tasted different from the recycled air inside, and I stood in it for 30 seconds doing nothing, which was both foolish and necessary. I had been off the grid for 12 days, and I expected the communication infrastructure to be degraded. Burned operatives operate in a gap, while the hierarchy reassesses what has been compromised and reconfigures. What I did not expect was to reach the first relay point and find it live and answered. The doctor's voice came on the line. He was speaking carefully, with the specific warmth of a handler who believes he is talking to an operative who has survived something difficult and has come home. He asked where I was. He asked about condition. He asked about what I had been able to extract before the exfil. I listened to all of this and did not respond. The carrier rhythm was wrong. It was a small thing, the kind of detail that only exists because an operative and his handler have been working together long enough to establish personal variations on protocol that never get written down, that live in practice and habit rather than in any file someone can find and read. 3 years ago, in a debrief following my second burn, the doctor and I had agreed verbally on a non-standard carrier cadence for our primary frequency, a timing offset that was irregular enough to defeat automated interception analysis, but simple enough to maintain without conscious effort, the kind of adjustment you make once and then never think about again, because it becomes part of the rhythm of the work. We had been using it ever since, through every contact across 3 years of operations. The voice on the line was using the standard cadence. The standard cadence we had retired 3 years ago. The copy had 4 days of observation and a cellular-level biological scan. It had my face, and my fingerprints, and my breathing pattern, and however much of my behavioral profile Esteban had assembled from the sessions. It did not have 3 years of a working relationship conducted in a specific frequency offset that had never been written down, that existed only in the practiced habits of 2 people who had been through enough together to stop documenting things. This was what Zero's assessment could not have accounted for. That human trust, at a certain depth, operates through channels that leave no physical residue. The copy was a perfect biological replica. It was not a perfect operational replica. Those are different things. And the difference between them is exactly the kind of thing that does not show up in a survey. Broke into the signal. There was a silence of several seconds. Then the doctor's voice shifted. The warmth dropped. The professional mode I recognized from the bad debrief came up. The voice of a man receiving information that requires immediate action and will require understanding afterward. He asked me 2 verification questions that only I would know the answers to. I answered them. He told the copy, on the secondary channel, that there had been a protocol verification issue that would require the return trip to hold until it was resolved. His voice, doing this, was impeccable. No tell in it. No hesitation, the voice of a man who has spent enough years in difficult situations to perform normalcy under conditions that are not normal. The copy accepted the delay and waited, because it had the social intelligence to understand delay, but not the relational intelligence to understand that the doctor was not in the business of accepting protocol failures without explanation. The doctor's other people closed around it in the following 40 minutes. Zero knew the moment the copy stopped transmitting. 8 minutes after I broke the signal. I tracked the timeline later, against the monitoring records. 8 minutes. He knew what it meant. He had lost the copy, and the archive access, and the operational cover in a single night. And what he did was nothing. 3 days. Nothing moved in any syndicate cell, anywhere in the network. The doctor's people were monitoring. Then, very efficiently, everything was gone. Every cell went dark over the following 8 days. Burned. Burning leaves evidence, urgency, the signature of an organization that has been surprised and is reacting. This was a planned withdrawal, executed cleanly. As if Zero had prepared for this outcome in advance, and his people had simply implemented a protocol they had been briefed on. The doctor's teams moved on 3 locations and found them vacated in good order. Nothing left behind that was not structural. No documents, no equipment, no personnel. Teep. The doctor spent 3 months trying to understand what had happened. He ran down every thread of the network he had been tracking, and every thread terminated the same way. Not cut, not burned, simply concluded. He could not tell if Zero's withdrawal was a defeat or an interruption. He could not tell what the operation had ultimately been designed to accomplish. Mulebran was dead. Formula was still uncompromised, as far as he could assess. The copy had been contained. Any standard metric, we had won. He did not believe we had won. In a conversation I was not supposed to be present for, in a corridor outside the room where his people were still trying to decode what they had found. And I have remembered it because of the specific quality of unease in his voice. He was a man who had spent a long time surviving on his ability to correctly assess what the other side wanted, and had completely failed to do so in this case. And the failure was sitting in him like something he could not digest. That was when the specialist entered the picture. She worked in an apartment that had no public name, housed in a basement level of a building in the capital that appeared on no administrative record I had access to. She was small, perhaps 50, with the kind of face that has been doing hard thinking for so long that the thinking has become structural. She had not been sleeping properly in some time. She had a file on Zero, on the Syndicate, that she had been building for 11 years, assembled from fragments that anyone else would have discarded. Linguistic traces in intercepted communications that could not be accounted for by any known language family, biological anomalies in the very limited tissue samples that had ever been recovered from Syndicate facilities. Architectural signatures in the compounds they had built and subsequently abandoned, signatures that repeated across locations, separated by thousands of miles, in ways that implied a shared design language, rather than independent construction. She spread her documentation across the doctor's table, and walked us through it for 3 days. When she finished, she sat back and said, "They have been here before, not metaphorically, not in terms of organizational lineage or the longevity of their operations, literally, on this planet, 40,000 years ago. The compound where I had been held was constructed on top of something, very deep, very old, the kind of deep and old that routine geological survey misses because it lies in strata whose age makes it red as bedrock rather than structure. The Syndicate had known it was there. That was why they had chosen that location. They had not picked it for its surface characteristics. or its proximity to transport infrastructure or any of the things that influence site selection for a human operation. They had come back to a location they remembered, a location they had built. The specialist showed us the core sample imagery. She showed us what was down there. I have looked at a lot of things in my career that I wished I could unsee. This went on a different list, not the unsee list, but the list of things that changed the shape of everything else. Structures, or the remains of structures, at a depth that corresponded precisely to the geological age of 40,000 years. Materials that were not stone, and not metal, and not any composite I had a name for, but that had maintained their structural integrity through 400 centuries of geological pressure. Geometry that was coherent and clearly intentional, but followed rules of proportion and function that I could look at for an hour without extracting meaning from. Whatever had been built down there, it had been built by something with different assumptions about what buildings are for and how space should be organized and what a door is. Zero's people had built it. They had built it 40,000 years ago when this had been, the specialist used the phrasing carefully, a viable installation, a node in something larger. She was not certain what kind of installation: refueling, administrative, research, strategic positioning. The records she had recovered were too fragmentary to give her the full picture. What she knew was that something had happened. Some large-scale event, possibly a conflict at a scale she declined to estimate, and they had gone, withdrawn from this system, left the installation running on whatever automated maintenance kept it functional across geological time, and now they had come back. Mulibrand's Argentinian was not a shield material. She said it flat, with no preamble. The way you say the thing you have been building toward for 3 days, and that changes the shape of everything that preceded it. Mulibrand had not known what he was working with. He was a scientist and a genuinely brilliant one, and the particular tragedy of his situation was that he had been brilliant in exactly the right direction, without knowing why the direction was right. He had found the compound in a geological stratum, a very specific stratum, at a very specific depth, at a very specific location, and it had been 40,000 years old, and still chemically active, and its interference properties with atomic resonance were extraordinary by every measure he could apply. Extraordinary enough that he had spent 20 years on it. Extraordinary enough that he had built 3 laboratories and consumed 4 research grants and filed the kind of detailed structural analysis that only comes from someone who has found the thing they were put on Earth to find and knows it. What he had been doing, without knowing it, was disassembling a piece of someone else's engineering. The compound existed at that depth because it had been placed there, not by any geological process, not by any human hand, by whatever engineer had designed the installation 40,000 years ago and had needed, in the course of designing it, to use a material with exactly the interference properties Mulibrand had spent his life documenting. The stratum Mulibrand had been mining for samples was the installation's outer casing. He had been pulling pieces of the wall off a 40,000-year-old alien structure and bringing them to the surface and analyzing them. And the analysis was accurate, and the synthesis he had achieved was real, and the formula in his head was a genuine human achievement, built entirely on work whose foundations he could not have known about. The Syndicate had not wanted the formula. They had wanted to know how much we had understood. The answer was enough to be dangerous. To them specifically, not yet. And possibly not ever in the direct military sense, but enough that the original assessment of negligible was wrong by an order of magnitude that Zero could not accommodate within his operational parameters. A species that had found the installation, been drawn to its materials by natural scientific curiosity, and spent 20 years reverse engineering one component of its architecture from first principles, was not a species that could be worked around. It was a species that needed a new classification. The specialist had recovered fragments of the original survey records. She translated the relevant entry for us, with the careful precision of someone who knows the weight of what they are handling. Surface population, early development, native baseline, promising, organizational complexity, pre-strategic, long-term trajectory, monitored, classification, negligible, negligible, I sat with that word in the silence after she read it. Negligible. 40,000 years of everything we had ever been. Every city built and burned and built again from the rubble. Every war that taught us something about ourselves we had not wanted to know. Every piece of hard knowledge dragged out of the dark, through generations of people working at the edge of what was currently possible. Building on each other in the only relay race that matters. All of it conducted under an administrative assessment that we were negligible, a monitoring item. Not yet ready. Zero had walked into this operation with that assessment current. He had sized the mission for a manageable complication, and had found otherwise at every point of contact. He had gotten me and Anna and the doctor's 11 years of documentation, and the copy failure and the signal intercept. He had gotten the full accounting of what negligible actually looks like from inside the organism being assessed. The second part of the problem was the machine and what to do about it. The specialist had spent 4 months in the field, mapping the underground structure through non-invasive techniques that were the only option that did not involve drilling into something 40,000 years old, without understanding what it would do when disturbed. What she had established was this. The machine, she used that word provisionally, always with the acknowledgement that it was likely inadequate for what she was describing, was a marker, a beacon, a navigation and status signal, broadcasting continuously in a frequency range that human instrumentation had never been calibrated to detect, because no human instrument builder had ever had reason to look for it. Casting, in the Syndicate's own administrative language, a status message that had been set 40,000 years ago and update and never. This location holds. This location is viable. This location is maintained. A flag in the ground, a note left on a door. Automated message from a civilization to itself, across whatever gulf of time it had calculated it might need to bridge. The kind of message that only gets written by someone who fully intends to come back. We spent 3 weeks arguing about what to do with it. The argument had 3 positions. The first was silence. Deactivate the beacon, seal the installation, tell nobody, and trust that without the signal, the Syndicate would have no navigational reason to return. The second was communication. Attempt to use what the specialist had decoded of the Syndicate's language, to open a channel, to establish contact, to negotiate some kind of arrangement, an acknowledgement of mutual existence, a boundary agreement, something that at least acknowledged the reality that we knew about each other, which was mine and which, I argued, for alone for 2 weeks before the doctor came around to it, and then the specialist and the rest of the team one by one, was simpler. We changed the message. I want to be honest about why I argued for this, because the honest answer is not purely strategic. The strategic case was solid. A modified status update in Zero's own system, authenticated with his own codes, was the most efficient way to communicate information he could not dismiss as enemy propaganda or intercept and fabricate. But the reason I pushed for it, the reason I kept pushing when the silence faction was gaining ground, was something less calculable. We had spent 40,000 years being assessed as negligible. We had not known about the assessment, had no opportunity to dispute it, no voice in the category we had been placed in. Zero had come back with that assessment current in his planning, had built his entire operation around it, and had found it wrong at every point of contact. I wanted the record corrected. Pride. I am not an especially proud man, and pride at a species level has always struck me as something that precedes very bad decisions. It corrected, because a false record has consequences, and an uncorrected false record about a species' threat classification in the operational database of a civilization that could reach Earth meant consequences none of us could bound. The silence faction was arguing for strategic ambiguity. I was arguing that we did not have the luxury of ambiguity with something this large. The specialist could not turn the machine off. She had been explicit about this from the beginning of her involvement. The architecture of the installation was too alien and too old for safe deactivation. She did not know what the power storage situation was after 40 millennia of operation. She did not know what a shutdown signal would do to the local geology. She was not willing to find out experimentally. She could modify. With enough time and enough careful work on the operational interface, decoding it character by character, testing modifications against her language models before committing them. She could change the content of the broadcast while leaving the hardware untouched. The authentication codes were the key. Zero's people had built their beacon codes into the signal's structure because a navigation marker is only useful if the receiving end can verify it as legitimate. The codes had been running for 40,000 years and were still valid. The codes, a modified message, would read as originating from the installation itself, indistinguishable from an administrative update issued by whatever authority had originally commissioned the beacon. The codes, we could tell them whatever we wanted. The limitation was vocabulary and grammar. The pros were the language that the specialist had been reconstructing from fragments, and there were gaps she could not fill without sources she did not have. The message had to be simple enough to assemble from the vocabulary she had confirmed, and unambiguous enough that a mistranslation could not be read as an invitation. This required 6 weeks of work rather than 6 days, and the 6 weeks required a degree of self-control from everyone involved. The silence faction lobbying constantly, new people with clearance arriving and needing to be briefed and integrated. The monitoring team reporting nothing from the outer system, but reporting it in a way that communicated they were not certain nothing was coming. That I would not want to repeat. What we composed was short, administrative language, in their register, authenticated with their codes. The specialist verified it against every fragment she had, 5 separate times, before she would call it ready. It said this location has been assessed, surface population, strategic level, reclassify, non-viable, do not return. That was it. No imagery, no demonstration. No evidence of our warships or our weapons or the 7 billion people living their lives on the surface above the thing we were using to send this message. Just the administrative language of their own system, reclassifying this planet in whatever catalog Zero's people maintained, in terms they would understand. We sent it, and then we waited. I am not going to tell you that the waiting was easy. I have done a great deal of waiting in my career. Outside locked doors, in cars watching empty streets, in cells that other people had prepared for me. And this was categorically different. This was waiting for something vast and patient and operating on timescales that made our monitoring intervals feel like nothing. We did not know if the message had reached Zero. We did not know if it had been understood or believed, or if Zero had sufficient independent intelligence of his own by now to know that the signal had been modified by the population on the surface. We did not know what believing it would mean operationally. Whether non-viable in their administrative language was a classification or an advisory one. Whether there was a process for disputing it. Whether Zero even had the authority to act on a reclassification without escalating to whatever command structure sat above him in the Syndicate's hierarchy. We did not know how many others there were. That was the question that kept me awake. Zero had returned to this system. Zero had, at some point in the 40,000 years since the installation was built, received the coordinates of this system and the status of the beacon and the administrative note that said, "This location holds. Come back when it is useful." If Zero had those coordinates, others might. Older files in systems we could not access. Copies of the original survey that predated Zero's own access to it. Navigation archives on vessels that had been operating independently for so long that a centralized reclassification might not propagate to them for years or decades or longer. We had changed the record we could reach. We could not know how many copies existed that we could not. Carried that uncertainty the way you carry a scar. It is part of the landscape now, present but not consuming, something you work around. Still carry it. The probes stopped coming. 6 months of silence, then a year, then 2. The doctor's deep space tracking, recalibrated after the specialist explained what to look for, monitored the outer edges of the system with a diligence that did not relax. Nothing moved that shouldn't. Nothing came closer. 3 other buried installations. The specialist found them eventually. Same architectural signature, same construction period, distributed around the planet in a pattern that suggested a much larger original network than Zero had managed on his own. Were sealed and surrounded with monitoring equipment that would detect a signal at the molecular level. The machine in the original compound continued to broadcast. It would continue to broadcast for as long as it had been running, which was to say for as long as any of us could meaningfully imagine. The message in it was ours now. I have spent a great deal of time since then, thinking about what Zero told his people when he withdrew. What words he used in that language I heard, through a cell wall, and could not identify, to describe what he had found when he came back to a world he had assessed as early and promising, and not yet ready to matter. I think about the specific bureaucratic problem he faced. An administrative database entry. Surface population. Negligible. That was 40,000 years old, and had never been updated because there had been no reason to update it, because this had been a quiet installation at the edge of the range. A long-term asset that did not require active attention. The kind of entry that accumulates in any large organization's records. The file that nobody reviews because nobody expects it to have changed. He reviewed it. And then he came back and found me in a cell refusing to break. Came back and found Anna in a nightclub building a network that had survived 7 months without compromise. Came back and found the doctor in his windowless room with 11 years of files. Of files on Zero's own organizational structure. Files assembled from the same fragments the specialist had used. Approached from the human end of the problem. Found a civilization that had done, in 40,000 years, what his models had projected would take 400,000. That had built, from the raw materials of its own intelligence and stubbornness, and the particular refusal to accept that the odds against it were conclusive, which is the most specifically human trait I know of, the refusal to accept the arithmetic of your own disadvantage, the insistence on continuing to try past the point where a reasonable accounting of the situation would counsel giving up. A world that looked nothing like the planet he had logged and flagged for retrieval. He had come for something his people had left behind. He left without it. He left with data he had not expected to be collecting, about a species he had expected to find in an early stage, and had found in something else entirely. Knowing that whatever he told his colleagues about what Earth had become, the message in the ground said the same thing in a language they could not dispute. Think about the cold chamber sometimes. When I cannot sleep, which is more often than I would prefer. The 6 hours in the dark and the cold, losing the edges of my thoughts, and the anger that kept the coal lit. I think about how that coal, that specific human stubbornness, that refusal to let the cold have what it wanted, is the same thing that has been burning in us for 40,000 years, in different forms, under different pressures, in different kinds of darkness. Always the same coal. Zero's assessment missed it because it is not something that shows up in a survey. You cannot see it from a distance. It does not manifest as a technological indicator or a resource metric or an organizational complexity score. It is something you find only when you put a person in a cylinder and run the temperature down and wait. Does not go out. That is what he found when he came back. That is what the machine in the ground broadcasts now in terms. He cannot question, authenticated with codes he cannot dispute. Not a threat, not a demonstration of force, not a species drawing a line and daring him to cross it. Just the administrative reclassification of a planet he had filed under not yet ready. Updated, finally, to reflect what 40 years of unobserved and unassisted and entirely self-generated development had actually produced. We are ready. The probes have not come back. The monitoring continues. The machine broadcasts, in the dark beneath the stone, carrying our 11 words in their administrative language, and will continue to broadcast them for as long as the maintenance protocols that built it intended it to run, which appears to be indefinitely. I come back to this world every morning and find it still standing. I find the people on it going about the specific magnificent difficulty of their lives without knowing what is written about them in a file somewhere in the dark between stars, without knowing that a woman stood aside from a cell door and looked at a point on the wall, or that a man in a basement decoded something 40,000 years old, word by careful word, and changed 11 of them, or that a coal banked against cold can burn for a very long time without anyone seeing it. It is enough, more than enough. The rest belongs to whoever comes after us, and they will be ready when the time comes in ways we cannot yet imagine. We always are. That is what negligible looks like from the inside. That is what we sent back.